Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm director of Kolnagi Foundation. Welcome to Kolnagi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. Today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Adrienne Childs. Adrienne is an associate at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, and she has written extensively. She's written on Henry Osawa Tanner, David Driscoll and Margot Humphrey. She's curated a number of exhibitions. She's also co-edited a book called The Black Body in European Visual Art of the Long 19th Century, Spectacles of Blackness. And her current project is an exploration of blacks in European decorative arts. Adrienne is the guest curator of an exhibition which is on at the Phillips Collection in Washington D.C. right now, called Riffs and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition. It's a really interesting exhibition. Would you tell us a little bit about what the genesis of the idea for it was?
Yes, well, and thank you so much, Nicola, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Riffs and Relations because it is a very personal project for me. I'm an art historian, a curator. I've taught African American art, European art. My work resides in those intersections and muddy waters between Europe and America, between races. And as a teacher, I've often taught contemporary artists who look back at the 19th century, look back at the Baroque era, the contemporary white artists, contemporary black artists who are doing that, how artists in the 21st century are still interested in that work. As the years go on, I still thinking about this. I did a few articles and got some other scholars together to think about it for a journal, but I thought that the biggest expression of this would be a great exhibition. I always thought it would make a great exhibition to bring together the contemporary artists who are, quote unquote, riffing, responding to European art. Fast forward, I was thinking that the Phillips Collection would be a great place to take this idea, and knowing that the Phillips was a museum of modern art, decided to tailor this whole discussion to modernism. And the director, Dorothy Kaczynski, was very interested in the project. They're coming up on their 100-year anniversary, and they thought it would be kind of an interesting thing to take on. Renee Maurer, who was the curator there, was my coordinator, and we were really able to shape this show. The concept is looking at how black artists have engaged with European modernism. I went all the way back to early work by Henry Osawa Tanner, who was the first black artist to really become an international star, if you will. Because we think of this with the contemporary artists like Mickalene Thomas or Titus Kaphar doing really interesting work. They are standing on the shoulders of many other black artists who have done this over the 20th century. Into the 21st century, black artists looking back at these power dynamics of art history, how artists like Picasso and Matisse really changed the landscape. There's a lot of controversy about particularly Picasso, but the fact of the matter is it was he and his cohort started a very important movement. How did it impact black modernism itself? Many of these artists in the show are actually modernists. They are coming along in the 1930s when other American artists are looking at this. What does it mean for a black artist to try to be part of that conversation? And what happens is at some point, the artists start rising up against art history. So you have the push and pull. And then by the 60s, 70s, the 80s, really, these black artists are saying, wait a minute now. We've been written out of this history. We are not a part of the major textbooks. The museums are not featuring our work. It's about the exclusionary practices of art history. So they start thinking about that, fighting back in that postmodern, ironic kind of way. But now we've kind of evened out, and we've got a lot more complex thinking about it. It's not either love or hate, but they're still interested in these quote-unquote masters and how they fit into that master narrative.
When you use the word riff, what does that mean?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's a very hard word to define. I think of it as a response to another work of art in the context of this exhibition, sort of a quotation and that takes a turn. But the reason that I added the word relations is because there are artists who are completely invested in what they've learned from someone else. So those are relations. And then there's many people in the show who are student and teacher.
I'm really fascinated. What each one of these artists brings really makes us see these paintings in a new way and brings out really unexpected and interesting questions. If we start with Titus Kaphar's pushing back the light, he's using tar on the canvas to push back the light.
Yes, he uses tar that kind of erupts. The canvas is crumpled and rumpled because the tar has pushed back the Monet painting. And we were lucky enough to get the work that it is riffing off of. So we have the original Monet Woman with Parasol right across the room from Titus Kafar's response to it. It's interesting because Kafar has a very complicated view of these things, and it's not a destruction of it. He talks about the innovations, looking at light, looking at skin, looking at all of these things, but he says they don't represent Black people. Impressionism really celebrates whiteness in its own context, yes, but because of the power of big exhibitions, and Impressionist paintings were worth so very much money, and major textbooks that teach art history have a really heavy dose of that material. Art history has given it so much power to the exclusion of others that maybe it became overdetermined. But what I was really happy when we went to borrow it from the National Gallery, the curator said, I'm happy to lend this because I'd like to see this work in dialogue. So let's think about what's going on with these narratives that we've invested ourselves in for so long.
He is, as you mentioned, in a long line of Black American artists who've engaged with Paris since the middle of the 19th century, beginning with Eugene Warburg, but Henry Osawa Tanner in particular. And I know you've written about Osawa Tanner, haven't you?
Yes, and I was glad to be able to include him in this. I think that the recent exhibition that was done in Philadelphia by Anna Marley positions Tanner as a modern artist. His style is definitely impressionist. He was there, he lived there, he spent his whole artistic life there. And we found a beautiful painting of haystacks that happened to have been done right after Monet died, probably an homage. The year that Tanner moved to Paris, there was a big Monet haystacks exhibition. And one of the things that we tried to do in the exhibition was find the real, actual connections. Artists who say, I am looking at this. And if I wasn't sure whether an artist was trying to think about modernism, I didn't include them. There's not much work from the 70s, like the Black Arts movement, because the artists were so articulate about, we are trying to find a Black aesthetic on our own terms.
So then I wanted to talk about the second generation, the people that went in the 20s. Hale Ruff was one of those,
Yes.
right?
Woodruff, even back from when he was in Indiana, one of the men that he worked for gave him a copy of Carl Einstein's Afrikanische Plastik compendium of photographs that was very influential in modernist circles. These ideas that are being espoused with the Harlem Renaissance. So he ends up going to Europe and he starts looking at Picasso, he's looking at Cezanne, very much interested in African art, and he really tries to pull all those threads together. The painting that we have in the show, The Card Players, is a riff on the Cezanne card players. And we know that painting was shown in a gallery while Woodruff was there. But he ends up sending it back to the United States and it goes on tour as sort of an example of what Black artists are doing, thinking about African American identity in a modern way.
Presumably they're interested both in the new ways of looking at the world and looking at light and looking at color, but they're also interested in the way that African art is being brought into the picture.
Yes, and at the urging of Alain Locke, the philosopher who was very much involved with African-American artists, or quote-unquote Negro artists at the time, he's urging them to look at Picasso and Derain and Matisse. They were the ones in front of this look to the quote-unquote primitive. And of course, it's all tied up with colonialism. And that's one of the things that later artists start looking back and thinking, wait a minute now, how did those statues come out of the Belgian Congo? That's very problematic. We know it now, but it was new at the time. So Alain Locke is telling them, look at modernists and look at the way they're doing African art, the way they're using it to find a new language of form. But you have a patrimony there that you should be able to use to come up with a Negro aesthetic. Now, all these ideas are very naive in certain ways, but at the time, you have to think about being in the 1920s, lynchings, minstrels. They had to fight against the stereotype of the slave.
Do you get the sense that it's taken a couple of generations for artists to feel free enough to step back and really critique the problematic side of their relationship with that art?
I feel like something happened in the postmodern era where artists just decided that all bets were off. The mystique about the power to shred up art history. And I think it just opened the door for all kinds of discussions around gender, race, and it's not just Black artists, of course.
The references to Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, which you see in Faith Ringgold and
Makita Ahuja.
They're thinking about the problematic aspects of Picasso in terms of the sexual dynamics of what's going on there.
Yes, since maybe the 80s, maybe before that, but certainly when the Primitivism show at MoMA came out, this has been a lightning rod for feminist artists looking at the sort of sexual aggression. Makita is a young woman, and Faith Ringgold's from the generation before that. Both of them, interestingly, have self-portraits in those paintings. And so they're not just Black women, but they're Black women artists. So they're representing themselves to a certain extent because they're looking at not only the sexual dynamics and the issues around race that Demoiselle present, but blackness, the blackness of the masks and the primitivism of the mask represents degeneracy. These women are also thinking about the power that Picasso has had as a male artist, how to position themselves in that legacy. So Faith Ringgold is in the studio. Even the masks on the wall in Picasso's studio where she's posing for him are talking to her about her heritage. So there's a lot there narratively about what was stolen, quote unquote, from Africa and how you as a contemporary artist can regain a footing. And Makita Huja is very interested in the sort of sexual dynamics and aggression through her own personal story of having a difficult pregnancies.
Then there's the series of paintings that are all riffs on the Manet Luncheon on the Grass, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe.
Yes, there were so many images by Black artists that engaged the Luncheon on the Grass. Bob Colescott was one of the originators of this kind of dialogue, and he did a whole series of riffs on works ranging from Van Gogh to Van Dyck. Colescott is a little complicated because you see this sort of male gaze coming through his work. He's still a little exploitative of female bodies, but he knows what he's doing. He's also looking at race in America, looking at quote-unquote miscegenation. In a lot of his works, you see Black and white figures sexually involved, and he's just trying to upend all that we hold dear and compete. He's a competitor, and he says that I'm competing with Picasso. I feel like I want to be on their level. Whereas another work by Renee Cox, so this is her self-portrait, and she's raiding art history, and she wants to be seen as a central figure. And the fact of the matter is the Luncheon on the Grass was controversial. It was a scandal, right? A success to scandal. So I think that artists are trying to see how do you further scandalize with Black bodies in it. There's always a reaction when races are changed.
Another person that's very interested in Manet is Carrie-Mee Weems.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Her take is completely different in that image because she's thinking about the idea of leisure, repose, beauty, and imagining these four little Black girls lounging in a park. And I can't help but think about the four girls who were killed in the Birmingham church.
I think this Mickalene Thomas version of it is wonderful. The way she also references the Matisse sculpture, the back.
Yes, and that's another reason I was so happy to be able to have that collage. It was commissioned by MoMA, and that is in MoMA's courtyard. And so I think that she very deliberately wanted to do her piece for MoMA. Everyone is staring back at you. It's and the gazing back is what is important in most of these things. Looking back through time at the viewers, getting people to think about art history in a different way.
Tell us a little bit about Ayanna Jackson. Is she the youngest of the artists that you have in the exhibition?
Yes, she's one of three who did work for the exhibition, actually. Ayanna is a contemporary artist whose practice is primarily based on self-portraiture. And that's one of the threads in the exhibition, women artists being their own subject. Of course, hers is a riff on Luncheon on the Grass. She wants to move through Manet all the way back to Manet's source, The Judgment of Paris, which was in a print thinking about mythology. She was also thinking about Black labor as well.
So are all three Ayanna herself?
Yes. She got costumes. I think she shot this in Paris, authentic costumes from the period. And she really wanted to show different possibilities of Black identities, a consciousness of Black women and people who lived in Paris in the 19th century. There's one thing to insert your 21st century self into the pose of a 19th century painting. But there's another thing to imagine other Black women that could have been there and resurrecting some of these, perhaps these lived experiences. It's not just Laure, who was Manet's model. There were more people of color living, working, involved in the arts as models particularly that I think we're going to learn a lot more about.
To finish, Elizabeth Catlett, she went to Mexico rather than Paris.
Right. She went to Mexico to study art and then ended up staying. And she got married down there. She did a lot of printmaking down there and lived there for most of her life. But she was always someone who synthesized African American stories, narratives, pre-Columbian art, and modern art. She studied with Osip Zadkine, who was in the show, the Russian, I think, School of Paris artist who came to the United States during the war. She said he introduced him to African art, which was kind of interesting. Much of her work is focused on Black women, the strength of Black women, narratives about Black women. So many of her early prints, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and the sculpture, Black Women Speaks, etc. Now, this one I chose for many reasons. It is a reclining nude, which is a typical European trope, but it has a very distinguished African mask face. And the title, Ife, refers to the African kingdom of Ife, the ancient kingdom that was known for their spectacular artistry. The Benin bronzes are coming out of there. So what I liked was the way she's blending all of these ideas. She's looking at Henry Moore without question, and she's looking at African art, and she's also looking at the Black female body. And perhaps she's suggesting, in a kind of an ironic way almost, that the roots of this kind of modernism are coming out of places like Ife. And what was interesting about it is when we installed the show, we put her in the room with the Matisse large-seated nude, which was being riffed on by Emma Amos. And all of a sudden, boom, I saw those two pieces dancing together. Now, I wouldn't suggest she was looking at Matisse's sculpture, but it really worked beautifully together to see how these relationships exist.
But super interesting in that sense of decentering art history, of showing how you can take all these different influences and bring them together and create something really spectacular. Adrienne, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. I wish we could bring that exhibition to London.
I wish you could too. It's not going to travel. But stay tuned for the next installment of what I'm doing with this material.